We will now begin the long-awaited session 3, which will discuss trade and economic tensions in Northeast Asia, titled From Trade War to Technology Hegemony. Our moderator, former Minister for Trade, Park Taeho, will lead the session. Please welcome all the speakers and the moderator.
Okay, can we start now? Good afternoon. My name is Taeho Park, President of Global Commerce Institute of Lee & Co. and former Trade Minister of Korea. I'm very pleased and honored to serve moderator for this session, titled Trade and Economic Tensions in Northeast Asia, from Trade War to Technology Hegemony. Before we start, I would like to say a few words regarding the topic of our session. First of all, it seems that trade tension, especially the current US-China trade conflict, is one of the most focused issues of the whole world at the moment. And naturally, economies in Northeast Asia, including Korea, which have very close trade relations with both the US and China, have particularly keen interest in this issue. Secondly, I would like to point out that the world economy this year is expected to grow at a bit lower rate compared to the previous year. Along with this general prediction, international economic organizations like the IMF and other economic forecasting agencies keep revising the annual world growth rate to even lower levels. Looking at this trend, we must be concerned the world economy might be hit by a crisis this year. In fact, at the World Government Summit held in Dubai early this week, Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF, mentioned that there are 4 kinds of clouds which could be undermining the global economy. These include the US-China trade tensions, financial tightening, uncertainties stemming from the Brexit outcome, and the slowdown of Chinese economy. Lagarde has warned that if we do not effectively manage the risks posed by these clouds, a storm might strike the global economy. As we hear from IMF Managing Director's warning, trade issues seem to be the ones that are producing most serious uncertainties in the global economy. Some experts even say that if a world economic crisis were to come, it will be triggered by trade problems this time, not financial problem. At the same Dubai conference, Professor Krugman has also said a serious world economic recession may come late this year or next year. In sum, there seems to be no doubt that the current world economic situation is extremely unstable. With all this being said, the topic of our session is very important and also timely. We know that the high-level negotiation between US and China is taking place in Beijing today and tomorrow. The whole world is paying close attention to the possible outcome of the negotiations. I think this negotiation is critical since only 2 weeks are left until March 1st. Of course, it could be extended, but this deadline for negotiation was set in Argentina at the end of last year. Let me stop my initial remarks here and begin our session. Today, we have excellent panelists from the US, China, and Korea. For the sake of efficiency of discussion, I would like to suggest the panelists focus on US-China trade conflicts, particularly the prospective outcome of the ongoing negotiations, implication of the outcome and its impact, how to manage the implementation of the outcome, and so on. Of course, these are only my suggestions, and panelists should feel free to choose their own topic. One more thing is about our time allocation. I would like to ask each panelist to speak about 7 to 8 minutes for their initial remarks. We will then have another short session for discussions among panelists. And finally, we'll open the floor for interactions with the audiences. Now we begin our discussion. I would like to invite panelists in the following order. I would first invite Chris Johnson, Freeman Chair in China Studies, CSIS, and then Professor Zhang Yunling, academic member, Chinese Academy of Social Science, Professor Byung-il, Ewha Women's University, and Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, President of KEI and former US Ambassador to Korea, Professor Song Hong, Chinese Academy of Social Science, and lastly, but not least, Ambassador Seokyoung, Senior Advisor at Lee & Co. and former Korean Ambassador to the WTO in Geneva. Without further ado, I now invite Chris Johnson. You have the floor for 8 minutes.
Great, thank you for that, and thank you to our hosts for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Seoul. I'm a political scientist, not an economist, so I'm going to have to come around this from a different direction to start off the discussion, but I think it matters. I think the place for us to start is the fact that the trade war, in my mind, and we heard it running through our discussion both in the plenary session this morning and in the US-China panel, the trade war is a symptom of the underlying disease, which is the deterioration in the overall strategic relationship between the United States and China. I think that's really the principal factor. So I'd like to start with how we got where we are. You asked us to comment about how we think the negotiations will go, so I'm happy to do that. I just come down from Beijing where I was meeting with the team and so on, so I can give some insight there. And then where might we end up, and what will the prospects be? In terms of how we got here, I think there's two fundamental factors. The first is some changes in China. The second is some changes in the United States, some of which the themes were mentioned this morning. And then the third is kind of the nature of our economic bilateral relationship, which I think has shifted fundamentally just in the last few years. So in terms of the changes in China, I think really we have to put it down to Xi Jinping coming in as the leader, and from my perspective, three fundamental transformations that have occurred under his leadership. The first is the move from a more sort of collective leadership system that Deng Xiaoping had put in place back toward a model that looks more like one-man rule. And I think obviously some of the side effects of that are there's a greater concentration of power. We see the fact that policymaking in Xi Jinping's new ecosystem is more informal, it's more opaque, and it's also more decisive. So the combination of informality and opacity with greater decisiveness means people get surprised pretty regularly under that context. The second fundamental change, I think, is the move from Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening policies to the industrial policy that we see featuring so prominently in the US-China trade dispute, especially programs like Made in China 2025 and so on. And I think the reason why we've gotten there is that obviously Deng's approach was to loosen the state's grip on the economy and allow foreign firms to come in and take advantage of that process and have huge profits while they were at it. Xi Jinping has decided to go in the opposite direction in many ways, largely because the challenge he faces is very different than the challenge that Deng faced. The low-hanging fruit of economic reform, if you will, is exhausted. The leadership now understands that there is a gap between where they were with the old economic model and where they need to be with a future-oriented economic model that will help them break through the middle income trap. Because they're in their system with the receding of communist ideology, it's a performance-based legitimacy system for the Chinese leadership. And so if they don't break through the middle income trap, they're finished as the ruling party of China. And they know that, and that means they're going to be very relentless in their pursuit of making that happen, probably far more relentless than, say, countries that are practicing some form of democracy. And then the third change, I think, is what we've seen in a shift in how China views its outlook of the outside world. For most of the last 20 years, China's official policy had been that China was in a period of strategic opportunity, is the language that they use, which basically in communist speak is the notion that China's external security environment was benign enough that it could focus on its economic development. Under Xi, I think we've seen a much darker assessment of the outside world. And he, unlike using terms like strategic opportunity, seems to talk a lot about struggle, which obviously has a lot more sort of sharp tone to it. And then, because of his concentration of power, the regime itself responds in a policy sense to that darker threat narrative. And we see things like changes in their military system, a massive reorganization that will make them a more capable and lethal and omnipresent military fighting force, things like this. These three transformations, I think, are what's rattling the United States in terms of how the strategic relationship is being viewed. In terms of the changes in the United States, I think the primary one is the decision to completely rebrand how we identify China in the national security strategy, for example. And a theme running through our discussion this morning was, well, we have these two great powers, we better start finding ways to accommodate one another on the international stage. Well, if the United States is formally identifying China as a strategic competitor, a revisionist power that practices predatory economics across the world, that doesn't leave a lot of room for cooperation, so it's a very important thing. The other piece is by the U.S. emphasizing notions like achieving dominance or preeminence in the region and globally, it runs the risk of painting the U.S. narrative internationally as backward-looking, as defensive, and as designed to somehow cling on to something rather than trying to push forward. I think it's actually a very negative narrative that we're trying to push. And it also has a lot of unintended consequences for allies and partners, especially when increasingly, as we were discussing this morning, they feel pressure to choose between these two great powers. And then the second piece, that's the sort of what's happening in each country. The second piece is the fundamental change in our economic relationship. It's a simple point, but I think it's very powerful in terms of its explanatory power, which is this notion that for 40 years our economic relationship was highly complementary. Now it has become highly competitive because guess what? China now, to break through the middle income trap, has to go exactly where the US needs to go to guarantee our respective future prosperities. And that means we're in something of a knife fight over the commanding heights of the 21st century knowledge economy. And I think that's a very, very important struggle between the two of us. And then, of course, what that means is that whereas that complementary economic relationship acted as a shock absorber for the underlying tensions in the difference in our governance systems, in the difference of our ideologies, now that that is removed, then those tensions are increasing and being reinforced as well and coming back onto the stage. So I think that's kind of how we've gotten where we are. In terms of the negotiations themselves, I think it's very highly likely that we're going to come out of this week's discussions and up through March 1 with some kind of an extension. You know, there's general recognition on both sides. You cannot achieve the goals we're trying to achieve between now and March 1st. That's probably the best we can hope for at this stage. In terms of and it probably involves what I call something like purchases plus, right? Which is China buys a lot of our stuff. The plus is select market access opening in certain sectors, financial services, insurance, things of this nature. And some efforts on both intellectual property protection / theft and forced technology transfer. These really are the two major issues that the U.S. is most concerned about at this stage. And then hopefully down the road we will tackle the broader issues. From my perspective, the way to have that longer term discussion is we have to disaggregate what I call the tactical backward-looking elements. This is the trade deficit problem, from the forward-looking structural elements, which is this competition for the knowledge-based economy that I referred to earlier. My view, the tactical backward-looking pieces is easy to resolve. China simply buys more stuff, and a lot of it. And that's kind of the offer that's on the table, increasing purchases by 30% per year over 6 years, which does lead to some really huge numbers in the out years. The structural forward-looking bits are much more challenging because our approaches to those issues are fundamentally opposed to one another. And I think we really only have two solutions there. We either, on the US side, get a lot more specific about what we feel are the true technologies that the US must control end-to-end for its own security, and then the rest of it is an open space. So in other words, it's sort of like a negative list, right? It should be short, and the rest is open play. Or and China has to grapple with the notion of dealing with its industrial policies, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, things like this. Or if that's all entirely too rational, then we should just admit to each other, look, it's on. It's a multi-decade Cold War for IT and IP, but let's do it quietly and stop scaring the heck out of our respective publics and markets and those of our allies and partners. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe some economists may ask questions later after we finish the first round of presentation. Now I want to invite Professor ZHANG.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to attend this very important event, setting up this new institute and also this China-US-Korea trilateral relations. Let me start with some recall that we are still living, considered to be in the post-financial economic crisis happened in 2008. At the beginning of the post-crisis, we had a good start. That is cooperation. We jointly launched the efforts through G20 and the other financial measures, try to solve the problems collectively. I think it's to some extent we call this a new stage of global governance. But now suddenly, this trend has changed. And after especially the President Trump, he changed to the more unilateral approach. The world economy, as all we realized, is highly interdependent. And world economy, we benefit in the past several decades on the multilateral system, unilateral liberalization, and also globalized business network. So it's a sudden turn, I think, put a lot of new great pressures because all the economies, especially major economies, highly rely on supply chain, regionally or globally. So if we take this unilateral approach on the bilateral negotiations, you still cannot solve this or even break up this, regional, global supply chains. Of course, we understand during these past decades, we have a lot of problems, imbalance, and many other problems. So every country try to find a way to solve its own problem. And probably to some extent, President Trump tried to solve this by his own way. But I think this can, change a lot of perspectives on the future also. If we see even in 2016 and even early of 2017, at that time, people still have a better expectation on the future economic recovery. But with this changed mood and policies, actions, and now all the projections on the future, on this year, on next year, even a longer future, quite differently. All lower their projections for economic growth. So this kind of a projection mood environment give a negative impact on the business, on the future investments. So the business side has, no a better expectation for the future. So I think this is very, very important to financial market and to the policymakers. Concerning Chinese economy, now, also we have to lower down the expectations for the future because Chinese economy is already undertaking this restructural period of time and lowered growth rates than before. But this is further, I think, worsen the environment for restructuring. And also the worsening the environment for investments flowed into China. So I think this may, give more difficulties to Chinese economy. I think another concerning the Northeast Asia, Northeast Asia economy is highly, especially CJK and China, Korea, Japan. The economies are highly interconnected and created networks. The Chinese economy as a backup of this, the past decade prosperity. Chinese economy plays two roles. One is domestic market for sales of Korean, Japan business in China. Another one is actually assembly. And China imports the parts, reassembled, and for export. So this sudden change, I think, break up this, I think the integrated chains among the three economies. Of course, to some extent, because of Chinese economy, become more competitive. Some of the business have moved to Southeast Asia, to other regions. But I think this sudden changed trade environment gave further, negative impact for the investments in China. So there is the discussion. Maybe there is the de-link among that China, Japan, Korea economic relationship. We have seen some already increasing moving out of the investments. So whether this de-link will happen or re-linked is a question mark. Re-link of these three economies need a better environment. So that's, I think, so Northeast Asia economy now also, as a general, in a very critical time. This trade war has really put further negative impact on the business among the North Asia economies. Concerning the recent trade negotiations, I think we hope for the better. And negotiators are gathering with very good mood. And they, according to the report, they have the delegation, 3 guys, they take 3 times for the photos and may try to make each in the middle and as a leader or what extent. But personally, I think it's not easy. And we probably have to lower the expectation. And they probably, be difficult to reach a grand achievement, as even the leaders agreed on. So, because there are 2 kind of issues. One issue is technical, the trade imbalance, RPR, and then they can be discussed in detail. But another, I think, negotiation is, we call it strategic, relating very much to institutions. And as mentioned by Johnson, that they have changed, understanding of Chinese economy moving toward more state-governed, but also I try to add that is there is a changed mood in China. Some discussions, they have a re-understand of this state-managed economy. because they consider to be the failure or crisis in the past as a result of liberal approach adopted or promoted in the United States. So China, if restructured and gets economy on, and they have probably play a stronger government role. So this kind of a trend maybe it's become a very big issue for the longer negotiation rather than, short. Finally, I think the concerning Chinese economy is very critical to the regional, global, even to some extent global. That is, if you've seen that Chinese government has put a lot of new measures, try to revitalize the Chinese economy through the different approaches. Increase money supply in many ways, and put a lot of emphasis on the private fresh loans to small and medium enterprises, and also it's a big, long project on this infrastructure building. So a lot of new measures, I think generally, in the general Chinese economy may not to come down very sharply, but structural problems will be shown clearly in the future. So I think we have a lot of things to do. The negotiations, if not long much, but however, it's a long race. Probably we have to prepare. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Zhang. Also, maybe some other panelists will ask some questions about Chinese policies and other issues. I will invite Professor Byung-il.
Thank you, Chairman. Before I begin, I'd like to extend my warm-hearted appreciations and congratulations to the inauguration of CHOI Institute. I recall my early days, my encounter with the chairman, founder Taeho. He inspired us to the power of asking why. He used to say, if you dare to ask why at least 3 times, you will get to the bottom of it. So let me start with the 3 why question for me. First of all, why trade war is taking place now, not later? Second, why do I believe a trade war between USA and China is more than simply trade matters? And third, why do I believe at the end of the day there will be no easy end to the resolution, even if Trump may attempt to declare win, even beyond Trump? I think they all boils down to technology. So let me try to explain why do I think so. Well, looking back, year 2000, so at the turn of the century, millennium, when US was almost secured China entry to WTO by passing trade agreement with China, a permanent normal trading relationship. Then President Clinton said, well, we'll pull China in right directions. Now, 17 years later, the very first Trump administration's China's WTO compliance report, the conclusion is so different. Basically, they're saying that we, United States, we made a mistake in supporting China's accession to WTO because they believe we failed to pull China in right directions. That right direction is, to American minds, open market-oriented trade regime. So for that reason, I believe even if there will be some compromise, such as China is promising to buy more soybeans and more Boeing airplanes and more GM cars, plus some guarantee for market access, I think that's not going to be sufficient enough. Because the issue is, to American minds, can China change from state-led economy to a bit more market-oriented, even though it may not be a market-led economy, but market-oriented economy? I think this is not just about trade issues. Maybe about system competition or technological competitions. Well, if you recall what you heard early this morning, the best expert about Trump is Trump himself. He is loving his guts. He believes he's the mastermind of deal making. So if you recall transactional nature of Trump, he may tempted to call win, but I believe such a deal may be only temporary ceasefire agreement, at best halfway house, because core issue of ongoing U.S.-China trade war is technology. And also it is related to deep-seated suspicion about China's economic system, which is basically, to American minds, non-market economy system. Well, what is at stake here is not just between US and China, but about whole future design of technological architectures, which we call digital transformation or fourth industrial revolutions. It's not just economic issue. It is a political issue and also security issues. But if you recall, very much global nature of technology, which requires global outreach, even for the best-minded, best talented companies from big country, because ecosystem is such. For instance, if you recall, even the discovery of prototype in the laboratory, it needs to go to testing, and it needs to be commercialized, and need to make further investment for improving and harnessing that technology. So ecosystem requires global connections. Otherwise, it is not going to be effective, successful. So fragmentations, which may be possible from lack of making true resolution of difference between US and China, may lead to a fragmentation ecosystem, which is very much ineffective. Well, as we witness intensifying conflict between US and China on Huawei, apparently US aims to contain and isolate China. But we are wondering, what is US game plan at the end of the day? Are they planning to create the future digital technological landscape without any element of China? Is it going to be possible? And also, what if China continues to refuse to give in and make acceptance, accommodation, US terms of demands? I think in that case, both is in the court of China. Perhaps there will be two options or possibility. One is a very drastic, happy ending scenarios for the rest of the world, not to the minds of China. That is, China's making a huge concession to USA. And so you may call it end of history in 21st century. But I don't think that is going to be realistic. That is a huge humiliation for China and Chinese people. So that's not going to be possible. What about the second option? Second option is, as it is happening right now in China, China seems to be determined to go all the way to increase self-reliance, thereby going to create so-called digital Great Wall. Well, I don't think that consequence is not going to be successful either, because it is going to be very much naive at best if Chinese policymakers believe it could build its own digital Great Wall simply relying on its own resources without access to and use of global resources. It's going to be unrealistic. In retrospect, it seems to me the United States is going through the recurrence of crisis and panic and fears, something like other countries overtaking USA, portending dire future consequences both economically and militarily. In 1960, it was competition with the Soviet Union. It was on space war. In 1980s, it was Japan, high tech. We all recall supercomputers and high definition TV and so on. And now China, about 5G and AI. Are we seeing the same movie like Groundhog Days? Well, if history is any guidance, each time US was fortunate enough to come up as winners. But secret of US winning was not because sheer strength of technology, but to my mind, because US was quite successful in commercializing technology. Even the best players need global market to innovate, succeed. Let me explain from experience of Qualcomm and SK Telecom and Korea telecommunication situations. In 1990s, when Korean as a country was contemplating what is going to be future digital standard for the country, then they looked for Qualcomm, less known to global audience, but Qualcomm had only one technology, only perfected in laboratory, so-called CDMA. And now we all know what happened, because Korea's made Qualcomm CDMA technology the first time in the world commercially successful. And outcome was, now Qualcomm is still kicking, arriving, alive and successful. And win for Qualcomm, and win for Korean telecom company and telecom industry, and win for Korean consumers, maybe global consumers. So, having said that, if the current Trump administration's way of complete shutdown of technology, as evidenced by new legislations in pharma by CPUs, also the complete shutdown of China talent acquisition program like 1,000 talent program, I don't think that is going to be effective. But some other people propose, well, we need to develop much more the precision measured approach like a small yard and big fence approach, something like, well, you cannot declare anything related to security, so create very narrow, well-defined regions under which you're going to build big fence. I tend to believe this approach is also fundamentally flawed. The reason why I believe that is it is contained, it is tied to the very big assumptions that China is in somehow moving away from current state-led economy, something else. So, what is my conclusion? Well, my conclusion is I don't see any effective, perfect, peaceful resolution. And perhaps I can end with worst case scenarios, which I call techno-nationalism. And moment of truth for Korea's and European Union countries and ASEAN may come when US, China ask other countries, will you with us or with them? I think that may be the beginning and the world as we are accustomed to have. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Choi. Now I would like to invite Ambassador Stevens, please.
Thank you, Dr. Pak. It's really an honor to be here today. I want to thank also Chairman Taeho for inviting us here, for hosting us. I have seen over the last 10 years since I first met you, Mr. Chairman, the work that you have done and your father did before you to build bridges throughout the world, and including with the United States. I thought, like a lot of people, that all these books were some kind of architectural statement, and I learned when I came here today that they actually are the books that I think you and your father obtained over the years to help prepare people going abroad for PhD studies. So the knowledge economy predates even our digital age, and I think it's a great tribute to what you're doing now, and I congratulate you on forming this great new institute. I'm not an economist either, so I thought, first of all, I would quote some American economists about President Trump's economic policies. I do think in the why a trade war now, I do think one of the answers begins with T, but I think there are deeper reasons as well, which you've well laid out. And then I thought, notwithstanding your guidance, Mr. Moderator, that I would focus a little bit on Korea and the U.S.-Korea relationship, because your expression was, I think the U.S. and China may be engaged in a knife fight for the future of the 21st century economy. Well, carrying forward from our discussion this morning, where does that leave Korea, I guess, in a knife fight? And I hope that maybe the relationship between U.S. and Korea and that economic relationship may provide some of the answers. The economists I want to quote, or none specifically, but the University of Chicago, the home of many famous economists, did a survey recently of 50 leading American economists, both self-identified liberals and conservatives. And another economist, a professor at the University of Michigan, looked over all their answers about, and this was asking them not just about trade policies, but about overall economic policies of the Trump administration. And this review that Professor Wallers is his name did, first of all, he started by saying, well, he said, I'm a professor, so I'm sure there's a lot of professors here on stage and in the audience. He said, I like to give grades. I know people in Korea like to give grades too, maybe in China. And he said, okay, I'm going to give the US economy an A-, with the potential for a better grade if the economic gains had been distributed more evenly. He's talking about since the start of the Trump administration. But of course, as he points out, any American president does not control the economy. He controls economic policy to some extent. So then he gives a report card on President Trump's economic policies. And this is drawn from this survey. The economists that were surveyed are nearly unanimous in concluding that Mr. Trump's policies are destructive. And this is why I think many economists are uneasy about his presidency, even though the economy is earning right now very solid grades. So here are his grades. Monetary policy, C. Fiscal policy, D-. Trade policy, F. Why? Well, I mean, these economists, and I guess they don't represent the American public at large, and we talked a little bit this morning about how the American public, particularly when it comes to China, feel like trade policies haven't been working. But the economists across the board are saying it's an F because Mr. Trump's protectionist impulses have placed him squarely at odds with, I think, well-established economic wisdom that tariffs are harmful. And certainly we've already seen that imposing tariffs on goods like aluminum and steel damage the competitiveness of American manufacturers. Global supply chains have made tariffs more costly than in the past. And of course, we saw as the US started a trade war with China, China quickly retaliated. That happens in wars, raising the tariffs on American-made goods. Mr. Trump has also created needed uncertainty with his threats. I agree with this. These economists, a person said this, to walk away, at least temporarily, from KORUS FTA, the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, and from NAFTA. And while the KORUS FTA has been successfully adjusted, what replaced it did not make, I think, a huge difference, but was probably an update that was needed. For NAFTA, that's still pending, and Congress must approve it. So certainly uncertainty. And when Mr. Trump tweeted that he was, quote, tariff man, unquote, our financial markets tanked, at least temporarily. The administration's own Council of Economic Advisors reportedly have concluded that so far the tariffs would reduce economic growth. And even by Mr. Trump's preferred metric, the balance of trade, his policy has not worked. The US trade deficit has risen to a 10-year high. So I agree with the sentiment, again, expressed this morning, that when you get into US popular views, and that's what politicians respond to, it's not Mr. Trump alone who's responding to the sense that it's time to do something about China, especially. That's something, not to be rude to our Chinese colleagues, that I hear from Americans across the board and throughout the United States. But there's great concern among economists about where this is taking it. But I'm going to step back from that for a moment and some of the other issues already addressed and try to look at the US-Korea relationship through the lens of some of these knowledge economy, 21st economy issues, 5G, the Internet of Things, Internet privacy, cyber threats, and try to take a longer view of this, the role that government policy takes in the modern economy. And I'll give you my conclusion right now and just spend a few minutes getting to that conclusion. My point today is that the United States and the Republic of Korea are well positioned to work together and to thrive in the future economy if our governments hold to broad values, there's that value word, that we have traditionally held. Now, I know that may seem a little far-fetched for now, but I think that should be our goal. I think that's what we accomplished with the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, both in the years it was negotiated, when it was ratified, and then when it was updated and re-ratified. So, you know, there's a story that goes like this, at least in the United States, and maybe here too. We talked about change. You know, everything has changed. Nothing's the same, especially when it comes to the technological revolution we're living through. And in the United States, the economic giants of the past, maybe you could say similar in Korea, but the giants of the past, General Motors, General Electric, US Steel, they were all manufacturers. And those are the jobs that have disappeared. The modern giants, Amazon, Google, they don't make stuff. They don't manufacture. And therefore, the thought is a whole new regulatory approach is needed to deal with this new reality, including in trade policy. But I would ask you, is that really true? I'm not an expert on this, but Google's success certainly is in moving information, not physical products, and Amazon is chiefly a logistics company that makes money by moving products from manufacturers to consumers with tremendous efficiency. So that's the case, but how new is that? If you look back very briefly at US economic history, two of the most powerful organizations of their time were American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T. That moved information, not products. And there was the railroad monopoly, which made a fortune moving products, not making things. In both those cases, AT&T and the railroad monopoly, the US government acted to protect consumers, for example, by regulating the privacy of telephone conversations and a number of other measures, and to preserve economic competition in both the information and logistics sectors. So the goal of regulation, I know regulation is kind of a dirty word in some circles in the United States, but the goal of regulation then, and I think now, in regard to internet security and online shopping, should be consistent: to protect consumer rights, including privacy, and to preserve economic competition so they cannot be taken advantage of by technologies or monopolies beyond their control. So I think clearly there are changes and differences, but I think what's really different today compared to those earlier times is not so much the nature of the problems, but their globalization. National authority to regulate the economy has given way to cooperation among countries. That is one major reason, but not the only one, that I very much regret that the US stepped away from the TPP, which I think Ambassador Roy also mentioned, which would have included provisions on digital trade. You've probably figured out by now that as a former official, I feel pretty free to speak my mind. And I will tell you that I am also dismayed by the Trump administration's seeming inability to distinguish between allies and adversaries. Not only the withdrawal from the TPP and the renegotiation of NAFTA, but the attacks on the WTO showed that it considers China, the European Union, Japan, Russia, Korea, all on the same footing, adversaries of the US in the economic arena. The administration's bilateral and frankly mercantilist approach to trade policy is a sharp departure from America's decades of work to strengthen international and regional trade relations and rules. I hope it's temporary. But yes, again, without belaboring the point, I do acknowledge that the United States' attitudes towards trade are not solely because of the Trump administration. There is a widespread and bipartisan belief in the US that free trade has not benefited working class Americans. And as our 2020 US presidential campaign develops, I don't think we're going to hear any candidate, maybe I'll be wrong, but I don't think any candidate is going to take a strongly pro-trade position. You will hear a lot about fair trade and incentives to keep US companies from moving abroad. We may return to more traditional trade mechanisms after 2020, but I think that further steps to liberalize trade will be politically difficult. But we could see. We're in a very unusual time. But despite these difficulties, I think the key point I want to leave with you is that I think the US and the Republic of Korea have some similar motivations. We do want to protect our citizens' health and safety. I think even the Trump administration wants to do that, to give them freedom of choice, and to give them maximum access to information. It's these kind of consistent policy goals that I think have created two very productive economies, the US economy, the South Korean economy, and led to a better quality of life for our citizens. And this to me is a kind of specific value, and again, values don't seem to be very much a part of the conversation now, that I think can underpin work we can do together. And what specifically can we do? Well, I've run out of time, so I gave grades at I conveyed grades at the beginning. My homework at the end is, I was very impressed by a paper that Wendy Cutler, who many of you know, and Hegemony put together for the Asia Society Policy Institute. It's called Advancing the U.S.-Korea Economic Agenda. It was just last month. And just a couple of things they recommended. There's much more in it. They urged Korea to join the CPTPP, successor to the TPP, even without the U.S. They suggested that Korea look to establish partnerships on renewable energy with individual U.S. states, where there's a lot of really creative and active work going on. That South Korea joined the U.S. and other like-minded countries in addressing China's unfair trade practices. That it be even more active in multilateral fora and international rulemaking. So I'm making some suggestions for Korea here. I hope you'll forgive me. There's room for the two countries to cooperate on developing standards, that regulatory thing, for autonomous vehicles, where both our countries are doing a lot of work, and to follow through on plans to launch an initiative on women's empowerment. And if it becomes possible, the U.S. and the Republic of Korea could cooperate in designing and financing infrastructure projects for North Korea. More generally, we have many similar problems to discuss: income inequality, youth employment, that's what I see in Korea's newspapers this morning, social safety nets. There's a lot that we can and should do together. And I think these are things that we can and do, hopefully in the future, with China as well. Because I think that even though we're focused on our differences, I think there are some shared demands by citizens for some shared concerns in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, Wendy was in Seoul a few weeks ago and presented this paper. Yeah. But then also, you mentioned about grading, about economist evaluation on Trump's policy. Let me wonder how Trump will give a grading to economists. What kind of grading we will receive, So it's kind of reciprocal feeling to each other. So now I invite Professor Song Hong, please.
Thanks, Dr. Park. Sorry, it's my great pleasure to come here to join this conference. And for China-U.S. trade relations, I think first point I want to emphasize is that this relations is very complex and also deep and in terms of very intensive and also comprehensive. One thing is China and the USA is the largest trade partner in the world, maybe in the history. Now is for the last year, for example, is almost $700 billion US dollars for the bilateral trade. So it's the biggest. And the second phase of the trade between China and USA is regional, and also maybe the global phases of these bilateral relations, because there is actually China and the USA is the two extremes of the globalization processes in the last 40 years. On the one hand, China's import a lot of things from neighborhood Asians, Korea, of course, Taiwan, Japan, and also ASEAN countries, and recently also some of the resources from Brazil and also other countries. On the other hand, we export the manufactured goods to US market, to EU market. So we have trade surplus with USAs, with EUs. On the other hand, we have a huge trade deficit with Korea each year, and also with Taiwan, and some years with Japan. So this is regional, and even the global. Globally, we have a trade deficit with Brazil, with Australia, with others. And on the other hand, we also have a lot of the trade surplus with other different countries if import a lot of the manufacturing goods. So this is the second phase. And also have another one is the third phase, is the rising power and the power now. So this is some of the competitions. So this is very complex for the bilateral trade between US and China. So if we want to change the relations of China and US's, have a lot of the, not only for both of us, China and US's, but also for regional, and even for the global economic system, especially for trade systems. This is one point I want to emphasize. Another one is that we also have, each year we have very big trade deficit or surplus with US's. For example, for this year, for 2018, we have from the Chinese side, statistic is something like 320 billion US dollars trade surplus with US's. From the US side, status is something like 410 billion dollars of trade surplus with US's. But in my opinion, I don't think it's the trade deficit with US's is Chinese problems or the Chinese phenomenon. I think this is another, it's the USC phenomenon or the USC problems. Why for that? Because from since the end of the World War II, we have the Bretton Woods systems. This system means that US must have a lot of trade deficit with other countries. On the one hand, on the other hand, you have the dollars as the hegemonic currencies in the global monetary systems. So this is a tariffing dilemma. So in the 1950s, 1960s, you have trade deficit with European countries. 70s, 80s with Japan and Asian needs, now with China. And I'm sure in the futures, other countries would fit in China as another trade surplus with US again. So the question is that if US want to reduce the trade deficit with China, so two questions for us. One is that US want China to go out of the global value chain or regional value chains and push other countries to fit in the position of China now. This is one solution. Another one is that this is one of the questions I want to ask is that it seems to me US want to change its economic systems US built after the World War II, especially for the US dollars, the rules of US dollars in the world economy. Because not the US want to reduce the trade surplus with China, but also with other countries as well, with the European Union, with Japan, with Korea, with all the other countries. So if reduce the trade surplus with other countries, the US dollars would be reduce the rules in the world. So this is a consequence for the adjustment of the bilateral trade and some of the implications for this change. And the third one is the relations between China and US is now is before China WTO accessions is based on the bilateral trade and investment agreement, bilateral. But after that, we based on the WTO multilateral systems. Actually, we didn't commitment when China want join WTO's commitment. For example, for the investment, we didn't commitment. We not required other investment in China. Didn't have the ownership requirement. We didn't commitment. And also in terms of technology transfer, we encourage the technology transfer in China. But we didn't commitment, we not do that. Because we have the TRIPS agreement there. We have a TRIPS agreement there. We didn't commitment more than beyond that. But what we now we see a lot of the requirement from US side is just mentioned about the new report, 2008 report about China commitment for WTO. Is that it seems we commitment such things, and we didn't do that. But the fact is that based on the multilateral systems. What we commitment is in the report of China WTO accession and in the protocol of China WTO accession, nothing else. So the last point is that, so in terms of the readjustment of China and the USA economic and also trade relations, I think is good for China. And personally, we welcome this readjustment of these relations. But in personal, I think there are some of the three conditions for that. First one is that, first, from US side, you must have clear idea, one voice for what your requirement from China. For example, it's confusing for us sometimes for the US teams negotiation with China have different voice. So also you also have different group, this morning mentioned, different group have different views for China. So what do we do next? So this is one conditions. Another one is you must have good justifications for what is required from China. For example, it's a good example is that it's US said 301 report is that many characteristics for the China's made in China 25 plans for that. But on the other hand, we look recently, last few days, we say USA also encourage to do the same things as China. And also we look at the Germany also does some of the made in Germany in 2030. It's the same things. So what is the justification for you ask us to do that, but you do the same things? Another thing is that is for the free market and also free trade regimes for economic systems. Now for the US government require us to open market. But what is the philosophy of the new administration is that is US first. US first wasn't meant for US first. It's protection. It's not the free trade agreement or free trade regimes for the trade systems. So last one is that these changes must be reasonable and also gradually, not changes overnight or very shortly, because just mentioned what the US and China relations is based on the multilateral agreement of WTOs. If we want to change something, we must to have negotiations and also more patience for that, not more pressures for you must to do that in 10 days or 3 months, must finish that. I don't think it's a constructive ways for to restructure the important relations of both countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Song. Now, Ambassador Choi.
Thank you. I'm also honored to be invited as a panelist to this prestigious event this afternoon. I am not economist either, but I'm a career diplomat, a retired career diplomat. But I had experience in negotiations, free trade agreement negotiations with China, United States, and European Union. And thereafter, I worked in Geneva for the WTO ambassadors. Therefore, I have some comments about the US-China trade disputes and its implication on multilateral trading system and the regional trade architectures. Now the trade, the global trade environment is totally changed because of globalization and at the same time, rapid development of disruptive technologies in communication and information technologies. At the same time, we are witnessing the growing sentiment against free trade. The protectionism, unilateralism is also growing at the same time. Against this backdrop, United States introduced a new trade policy, which is called America First trade policy, which favors unilateralism rather than multilateralism, bilateralism based on US power, and then strengthening the enforcement of the US domestic trade law to foreign countries. We also witnessed the tariff escalation dispute with China. And the US also introduced very stringent foreign direct investment review mechanisms, which was passed in August last year by US Congress. And they also strengthened the export control regimes. And at the same time, when we see the elements of US, Canada, and Mexico free trade agreement replacing NAFTA, we can see a very distinctive nature of elements, which is non-market economy status issues, and also exchange rate issues, and the labor value content issues, and national security issues are contained in the trade agreement, which was unprecedented. Therefore, US is now introducing a new trade policy and applying to the foreign countries' relations. And of course, China has been implementing Made in China 2025 and try to push actually the plan as they had in mind. Academia and scholars are talking about the root causes of this conflict. One view is that it's because of a systemic difference between Chinese state capitalism versus United States market-driven system. The other view is that it's a hegemonic struggle between America first, the high-tech technology, versus Chinese made in China 2025. Anyway, against this backdrop, two big giants has been engaged in the negotiation, targeting the final agreement March the 1st this year. I think it may be postponed. We know that 4 issues are on the table. One is shopping list. Second, market access. Third is structural issues. And lastly, intellectual property right issues. In my view, first 2 issues would be relatively easily to be sorted out. But the last 2 issues, IPR issues and the structural issues, which may contain state-owned enterprises and the subsidies and non-market economy status of China, those issues are really structural and political implications. Therefore, it's very difficult to predict that both sides could reach amicable solutions. But good news is that, in my view, US and China has a good reason to conclude the deal as early as possible because of their own domestic political considerations. But the devils are in detail. It's very difficult to strike a deal. It's difficult to strike a thorough deal on those 4 issues. Therefore, if the deal would be made, the deal could be a kind of a half-done deal. And then if the half-done deal would be made, the implementation, how to monitor the implementation of the other side is another question. Therefore, still very difficult to follow up. I think this trade tension between the 2 countries will outlast the Trump administration because US protectionism was not necessarily introduced by Trump alone. Most of the legislative actions was taken by US Congress. Therefore, the US trade policy will continue even after Trump administration. And from the tariff escalation confrontation carried out last year by the 2 countries, I think the 2 countries will reduce dependency and vulnerability which may come from the other side. And also, even if the trade deal would be made between the 2 countries, the implication is very complex to a third country because companies trading with the United States must reduce potential risk which may come from their trade with China and vice versa. It means that the global supply chain may not be as merged or further developed, but it's divided. China centered the global value chain, and then America centered the global value chain could be made. That's not good. It's quite opposite direction of the real commercial activities are being developed. In that sense, two issues are very important. In order to avoid this kind of undesirable directions, we need to strengthen multilateralism. The WTO reform issues are high on agenda item in Geneva. So far, European Union, Canada, and other countries made some proposals, but US never officially respected in positive ways. Likewise, China is engaged in the discussions, but China never presented their own proposals for the improvement of the WTO system. Now we heard that US, Japan, European Union have informal discussions on the improvement of the WTO system, but we have to wait and see whether those ideas could be bought by China and other countries. And another area is the regional economic cooperation in Northeast Asia and East Asia. This region, despite economic powerhouse role in the global economic activities, institutional mechanism is deficient. And in that sense, we have to strengthen existing trade architecture such as Korea-China FTA and ASEAN plus 3 FTA networks. And we have to facilitate the conclusion of CJK FTA, China-Japan, Korea FTA, and RCEP negotiations. And just as Ambassador Stevens mentioned, actually Korea also should consider positively in joining CPTPP. And at the same time, I would like to urge United States and China to stop applying unilateralism against Korea. In fact, the US introduced Section 232 application on steels and aluminum Korea last year, and still automobile issue still pending. We don't quite understand why US is doing. We already concluded Korea-US FTA according to the strong desire from President Trump, but actually the US is still having the leverage of the automobile, the tariff issues. And China also have been applying coercive economic sanctions against other countries, including Korea. We hope that all this unilateralism would be stopped. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Choi. We don't have much time left. We are allowed to use a few more minutes because we started a little bit late. You hear 6 panelist speeches and presentations, so many different issues. I cannot really give a summary or kind of guidelines to wrap it up, but I want to give some opportunity, very brief opportunity to ask some questions or make comments among panelists. If you don't have it, you can skip it, but raise very brief comment or questions, and then and also the panelists should spend a very short time to answer this comment or questions. So let me go backward from Ambassador Choi. Do you have any questions or comment to any panelist here? Very brief.
I have a question to my American colleague. In fact, both of you. CPTPP was effective end of last year without United States. Now the Japan, Australia is taking the leadership. And now, as you know, Korea-Japan relations are not that much good. And Korea, in my view, Korea must join the CPTPP in order to actually work as a member of this Asian Pacific economy. But I think that because of bilateral relations, I think the joining to CPTPP would not be that much easy. Then is there any possibility that the United States can kind of intermediary role to back it up?
So Song, yeah, you skip, okay, and then Ambassador Stevens, do you have any question, or you can answer to his question?
Okay. Well, maybe I'll do both really briefly. I think you raise a really interesting point, Ambassador Che. There is some discussion, I think, in circles in the United States about whether or not the United States should be trying to do something a little more active, even if it's not in public, to address the tensions, the rising tensions between Japan and Korea. And there are those, I mean, I think both on all sides of the political aisle, who compare the apparent relative quiescence and inactivity of the Trump administration with previous administrations. So I think you make a really interesting point. It makes sense to me. My return question is actually to you too, since you are an expert on the WTO and you mentioned it, is one thing I noticed in the press, but it really did not get very much attention in the United States, and I don't think it did in Korea, was this WTO finding in favor of Korea, although not in the amount that was asked, with respect to the U.S. action tariffs on Korean washing machines, the anti-dumping. Yeah, I don't have the trade vocabulary here, and I wonder if what you see is the implications of that. I mean, I haven't seen a big reaction from Washington yet, but.
Professor Choi, you want to ask any question?
Oh, yes. I have question and comment. First of all, comment on Chinese industrial policy. I think any
Professor
sovereign
Zhang?
state,
Professor Zhang?
perhaps the both of
Yeah,
them.
okay.
I think any sovereign state, they have sovereign right to pursue industrial policy as long as it is consistent with our understanding of global trading system. They keep saying that, well, Germany pursued industrial policy. It was a long time ago. And Japan pursued industrial policy. And Korea pursued industrial policy. First of all, I tried to correct, not all industrial policy was successful. It had huge negative consequences. We see very few and seldom successful cases. And second, so in that regard, perhaps I would be surprised. Simply, you keep saying that, well, we have sovereign right to pursue industrial policy, as if it is not related to any understanding of global trading system. I think you're making a mistake. For instance, from the experience of Korean businessmen, they made tons and tons of investment deep in China, like semiconductor, and also the automobile and electric car battery. But once you put a lot of investment, now China is seen as keep shifting bars and hurdles. I think that industrial policy you cannot tolerate. So I'd like to hear your view. And also the reason why I have a deep suspicion about near impossibility of solving the problem is, while we make a lot of attention to Made in China 2025, but I think the global community, they have growing concern about so-called digital Great Wall. For instance, recently Chinese government, they legislated or about to legislate so-called Internet Plus policy. That is, if Chinese state demands any firm operating in China, you have to release information. So, if they have huge, big, blown definition of security, then that is virtual surrender for, the foreign company operating in China. They have to release all this information. So I think that is the main reason why global community out there, they have keep suspicions. So I'm asking for any corrections or rebuttal for these questions.
Okay, Professor Zhang, you can answer this question, and also you can also ask some questions.
This question actually raised by Dr. Song, so I try to answer it. I think as the officials also announced, this 2025 is not as a planning economy plan. It's a guiding direction which, make both of these market, business, pay more attention, also created the, financial venture capitals, and so a lot of things will go to that direction. It's not direct to invest as President Trump just announced, a few days ago, the American also announced the AI and the others have some targets and plans, and so I think probably this is the real meaning of that. If that's some extent which government will govern, I think with the pressure of negotiation, I think as people said, government no longer talk about that. So, I think it's different. It's a frightened American that I think is more based on the strategic competition, long view of this as a big competitors in almost all the advanced sectors. This has raised the strategic concern like that. And also, as you see, recent negotiation, there was some positive response from China's side. Until now, Chinese government is still very cooperative, even with the happen of the Huawei case and CEO a case and that many things. So I remember that's the statement announced following after that negotiation in Washington. They said all these issues raised by the U.S. side is also the major concern of China's interest. So that means they can be discussed and find a way how, fit. And one thing additionally, before negotiation, Chinese government announced more than 20 of liberalization package, and including that negative list of liberalization approach, which I personally pressed government for a long time as involvement of FTA negotiation, also pre-national treatment, and many others. So there were some positive signs which, Chinese government itself realized it's time and to change. That's one point. Concerning, I think it's my question is to probably Chris, that how far that U.S. government will go to block or close down or reduce the connections between China and U.S. force, including the reduce the students, involvement of experiment projects, and many. Seems a long package of decouple. That what do you think is it's a long strategy, or has go too far that close down what we have already achieved? Because China benefit a lot from this past experience, students, exchange of scholars and government officials, and learning process. So that's a basic concern in China side. Business also travels rejected recently by same cases, So how far to go, I think? That's my question raised on you. Thank you.
Okay, very nice, because your turn. You can answer the questions, and also you can ask a question.
I don't have any questions to ask. I'll try to answer this one, although it's a very complicated one. I think the first answer is you should not presume grand strategy when it comes to Mr. Trump. I've been actually struck all day at how much credit our Asian colleagues are giving to President Trump for deep learning and strategy and thoughtfulness. I can assure you that's not what's happening. But to your point about how far it might go, I think it's important. Kurt Campbell hit on it this morning. The administration is deeply factionalized on these issues. There are definitely some who have a very comprehensive strategy in this area. Thankfully, they keep sort of losing out. This is one area where Trump's perhaps transactional nature and also his short attention span is working to China's favor. It was very close about 6-8 months ago to the notion of much more strict investment regulations, and especially on visas, especially as it relates to students. And in this case, the president's obsession with dollars and cents actually worked to China's advantage, because he sort of said, well, won't we lose a lot of money if we do these things? Everyone's looking at the floor and so on, and eventually someone says, well, yeah. And he said, well, we're not going to do it then, But don't underestimate the cleverness of those who are so motivated to continue to press the issue. And then I guess the other issue is we have to recognize one of the challenges with students coming into STEM firms and other areas is that, China the Ministry of State Security needs to stop encouraging or arm twisting students to do these things in the United States, because there are far too many cases where it's abundantly clear that they're under instruction to do these things. So the Chinese side needs to work on it as well, and then maybe U.S. suspicions will go down a little bit.
Yes, quick response. Actually, the refrigerator, Korea filed the lawsuit to WTO against the United States several years back, and 2 weeks ago, actually, Korea won the case with the exact amount of the retaliation against the United States. I think this judgment is almost the final judgment that WTO appellate body could make, because appellate body judges would be reduced by 1 at the end of this year. Therefore, they could not make a judgment from next year. So it will soon be paralyzed. But I mean, actually, when trade disputes are there and there is a third-party, independent third-party validator like WTO dispute settlement system is functioning, I think that is good. Even if Korea loses the case, actually, we have to accept. But the problem is, this kind of a judiciary system in the WTO would not be functioning any further from next year. Then we need to have a positive engagement from the United States. Thank you.
I know you have still more questions or more comments to make, but I will also open the floor. So we'll receive some questions and comments from the floor. Please raise your hand. You want to make some kind of questions or make some comments. Anybody who want to do that? From the floor. Oh, I thought there should be many. In the floor. Professor Yun, then I don't have to hurry our session too much. Nobody? No? Okay.
We make everything is clear now.
That's right. Long guess.
Well, I think we had a very productive discussions, but still we didn't find out the final kind of resolution or some kind of prospective outcome from these negotiations. But we talk about global economy, we talk about crisis, things like that. So I hope these two economic giants should come up with something. But as an economist, I'm an economist by training, this tariff escalation between the two countries are really hurting to each other. And on that kind of consideration, I always predict tariff war should be ended at this time. But other things like long-term issues and IPR issues, maybe they come up with some kind of agreement, but we cannot judge whether this agreement is effective or not, because we have to monitor and implement the outcome. That's why we need a better system to not only manage these two bilateral relations, but global trade relations. We need WTO. But Professor Song mentioned that the WTO is an organization when China acceded to the WTO and maybe abide by the rules. But WTO is lacking hugely in terms of governing the new issues and effectiveness of decisions. So I think this is a way we should move. In other words, we should reform WTO. We cannot do it overnight, but I strongly want to hope that US should turn to this direction so that we can do something gradually. Well, with this note, I would like to conclude our session. Please join me to appreciate this panelist for excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.